Sarah had been working from home for 8 months when she first noticed the tapping. Three soft knocks, always at 3:17 a.m., always from the wall she shared with apartment 4B, the unit that had been empty since she moved in. The isolation had started as a blessing. No more crowded elevators, no more small talk by the coffee machine, no more pretending she was fine when colleagues asked about her mother's funeral. Just her laptop, and the blessed silence of her one-bedroom sanctuary, 12 floors above the city's chaos. But silence, she learned, had weight. The tapping became routine. Sarah would lie awake, counting the seconds until 3:17, muscles tensed for the inevitable sound. Three knocks, then nothing. She called building management twice, but Mr. Chen insisted 4B remained vacant, had been vacant for over a year since the previous tenant's incident. What kind of incident? Sarah pressed. Nothing to concern yourself with, Miss Park. Old pipes make sounds, but pipes don't knock in perfect rhythm. Sarah started tracking the sounds in a notebook, documenting times and patterns. The entries grew obsessive. 3:17 a.m., three knocks, pause, silence. Around three knocks, softer today, almost hesitant. Three knocks, but tonight I heard something else. Breathing. Work became impossible. Video calls blurred together as Sarah found herself staring at the shared wall, waiting. Her supervisor, Janet, noticed the missed deadlines, the distracted responses during meetings. Sarah, you seem distant lately. Is everything okay? Everything was not okay. Sarah's mother had died alone in a nursing home during lockdown restrictions. Sarah hadn't been able to visit for the last 3 months of her life, hadn't held her hand, hadn't said goodbye. The guilt gnawed at her insides like something hungry and alive. By month 9, the knocking had evolved. Sometimes it came during the day, while Sarah was on calls, while she ate her solitary dinners, while she tried to sleep. The rhythm changed too. Three knocks became 5, then 7, then a frantic drumming that seemed to move along the entire wall. Sarah pressed her ear against the wall one Tuesday afternoon and heard something that made her blood freeze. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate pacing from someone who shouldn't exist. That night, she saw the shadow. A dark figure passed by her window, impossible since she lived on the 12th floor. But there it was, a human silhouette moving slowly past her blinds. Sarah yanked the cord, but the street below showed only empty sidewalks and distant traffic. I'm losing my mind, she whispered to her reflection in the black window. Her reflection didn't disagree. It looked hollow-eyed and strange, like someone she used to know. Sarah convinced herself that knowledge would save her sanity. She researched the building's history, diving deep into city records and newspaper archives. What she found made her wish she hadn't looked. Marcus Reeves, 34, had lived in 4B for 3 years before his death. Cause: suicide. Method: hanging. The article was brief, clinical, but Sarah found more in the building's internal incident reports, accessible through a friend who worked in property management. Marcus had complained for months about strange sounds from 4C, Sarah's apartment, knocking, footsteps, voices. He'd grown increasingly agitated, insisting someone was watching him through the walls, that his neighbor was documenting his every move and planning something terrible. The reports painted a picture of escalating paranoia. Marcus had barricaded his door, covered his windows, stopped leaving his apartment entirely. His final complaint, filed 2 days before his death, was a rambling handwritten note claiming that she in 4C has been recording my thoughts somehow, stealing my sleep, making me see things that aren't there. Sarah stared at the reports until the words blurred. The previous tenant of her apartment had been Mrs. Eleanor Voss, an elderly woman who'd lived alone for 15 years before moving to assisted living. Neighbors described her as quiet, keeping to herself, rarely seen except for brief trips to check her mail. Just like Sarah. Sarah pressed her ear to the wall and heard something new, her own voice, muffled but unmistakable, coming from inside 4B. She was listening to herself having a phone conversation from 3 days ago, word for word. Her hands shaking, Sarah grabbed a flashlight and headed to the hallway. The building was tomb quiet, emergency lighting casting long shadows. She stood before 4B's door and pressed her ear against the wood. Inside, she heard typing. The same mechanical rhythm of her own keyboard. The same pattern she used for her morning reports. She heard her chair creaking, her coffee mug being set down, her own breathing, but she was standing in the hallway. Sarah ran back to her apartment and called building management. Mr. Chen answered on the first ring as if he'd been waiting. "There's someone in 4B, Sarah gasped. They're copying me. They have recordings of my voice." A long pause. "Miss Park, we've been concerned about you. Mrs. Rodriguez in 4A has been complaining about noise from your unit. Constant typing at all hours, talking to yourself, knocking on walls. That's not me. That's them. The person in 4B. Sarah, there is no one in 4B. You're the only tenant on that side of the building. 4A is Mrs. Rodriguez, 4C is empty pending renovation, and you're in 4D. 4D? Sarah's voice cracked. I'm in 4C. I've always been in 4C. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah, you've been in 4D since you moved in. Your lease clearly states 4D. Are you feeling all right? Sarah stumbled to her apartment door and stared at the brass numbers. 4D. But that was impossible. She distinctly remembered 4C. She had the lease somewhere, didn't she? Inside, she tore through her desk drawer looking for the rental agreement. When she found it, the address clearly stated 4D. But in her memory, she'd always lived in 4C, the apartment to the right, not the left, the one that shared a wall with 4B. Sarah stood in her living room and tried to map the building in her mind. If she was in 4D, then 4B would be across the hall, not adjacent. The wall she'd been pressing her ear against, the wall where she heard the knocking, connected to 4C. The empty unit pending renovation. With mounting horror, Sarah realized the truth. The knocking wasn't coming from 4B, it was coming from 4C. The sounds, the footsteps, the recordings of her own voice, they were coming from the empty apartment that she somehow remembered living in. But she'd never lived in 4C. She'd always been in 4D, hadn't she? Sarah grabbed her keys and walked to 4C's door. The lock turned easily, as if it recognized her touch. Inside, the apartment was identical to hers, but reversed, a mirror image. And there, on a desk by the window, sat a notebook filled with her handwriting. Day 247. The tapping from 4D continues. She never stops typing, never stops watching. I can feel her eyes through the walls. Day 251. I see her shadow in my window sometimes, but we're on the 12th floor. How is she out there? Day 263. I think she's stealing my memories. I can't remember what apartment I'm supposed to be in anymore. The final entry was dated today. Day 267. She's coming. I can hear her keys in the lock. She's figured out how to get in. But I was here first, wasn't I? Or was she? Which one of us is real? Sarah dropped the notebook. In the reversed apartment, she saw another version of herself, hollow-eyed, hollow-cheeked, staring back from what should have been a mirror but was actually a window into 4D. The other Sarah raised her hand and knocked 3 times on the glass. Sarah knocked back 3 times and watched her reflection's mouth move in silent words. Which one of us died in this room? Outside, in the hallway, she could hear Mr. Chen's voice on his radio. We found her. The missing tenant from 4C. Looks like she's been dead for about 8 months. Neighbors never heard anything, but you know how these isolation cases go. Sometimes they just slip through the cracks. Sarah looked at her hands. She could see through them now, just slightly. In the distance, she heard her mother calling her name, the way she used to when Sarah was late for dinner. She'd been late for everything in the end. The knocking stopped.